Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Whitney Museum of American Art. I'm Donna DeSalvo, Deputy Director for International Initiatives and Senior Curator, and it is my distinct honor to introduce tonight's program, a lecture by Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, our Melva Bucksbaum Associate Director for Conservation and Research, entitled The Falsification of Time, a term coined by the artist Sol LeWitt. As the recipient of the 2016 Forbes Prize, the highest award given by the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, Carol delivered the Forbes Prize lecture to over 500 conservators from 45 countries at the IIC Congress in Los Angeles. The Falsification of Time is a version of that lecture, and in it, Carol will position complex issues associated with the art of our time, such as 3D printing, in the historical context of art conservation. We are also honored that Yve-Alain Bois, Professor of Art History at the Institute for Advanced Study, will join Carol in conversation after the lecture. I have worked closely with Carol for more than a decade. At times, our work is highly practical, but more often than not, it takes us into uncharted territory. And that is particularly the case when dealing with artists who, by design, intentionally question the fundamental nature of the art object. Of course, this is where it gets interesting, and when our discussions veer ever more philosophical. It is here that we confront notions of materiality and immateriality, even being and non-being. It is also in moments such as these where our respective roles, curator and conservator, become marvelously intertwined. In this way, we both give voice to the artist. And in fact, this spring, we even worked as co-curators on the presentation of Michael Heiser's actual-size Munich Rotary as part of the Whitney series Open Plan. Carol has served in addition to her role here at the Whitney, she has also served for over a decade as the founding director of the Center for the Technical Study of Modern Art at the Harvard Art Museums. Previously, she worked for 19 years as chief conservator of the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas. During that time, she consulted on the conservation of 20th century paintings at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and founded the Artist Documentation Program, where she interviews artists about the technical nature of their art. She's lectured widely on the conservation of modern art and contributed to monographs on Jasper Johns, Bryce Marden, Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, Cy Twombly, and Jay DeFeo, and to the Catalogue Raisonné of Barnett Newman. Just a few artists, really. In 2009, she was also elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, marking the Academy's first recognition of art conservation. Yve-Alain Bois is Professor of Art History at the Institute of Advanced Study, considered to be one of the most influential centers for the study of art history. A specialist in 20th century European and American art, Yve-Alain is recognized as an expert on a wide range of artists, from Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso to Piet Mondrian, Barnett Newman, and Ellsworth Kelly. He's curated and co-curated numerous highly influential exhibitions, including Piet Mondrian, a retrospective, L'Enforme, Mode d'Emploi, and Picasso Harlequin, 1917 to 1937. Yve-Alain is also the author of numerous publications, most recently the exquisite, and I emphasize that word, Ellsworth Kelly Catalogue Raisonné of Paintings, Reliefs, and Sculpture, Volume 1, 1940 to 1953. He and Carol co-taught at Harvard University and worked closely together on the Catalogue Raisonné of Barnett Newman. I think that this evening's lecture and conversation is going to take us into uncharted territory, and we'll be all the wiser and perhaps even more curious as a result. So please welcome Carol Mancusi-Ungaro.
Thank you, Donna. Before beginning, thank you all for coming, too. This is amazing. Before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the conservators and colleagues I see daily who have informed my thoughts through their work and questions. Margot DeLito, Christine Fronart, Reinhard Beck, and Richard Blows, Clara Rojas Sebesta, Nora Naj, Matt Skopek, and the talented exhibition staff that we have here at the Whitney Museum who often share in our work. I'd also like to acknowledge Heather Cox, who with me has stood with me for 15 years, and together we have built the conservation department at the Whitney. And finally, I would like to acknowledge Andrew Petrin, who was the chief conservator at the Yale University Art Gallery years ago. He taught me many things, and for that, for which I am most grateful, is an unswerving respect and dedication to the genius of artists. I interviewed the American artist, Sol LeWitt, whom I did not know, at his invitation 2 years before he died. He didn't want to be documented on film, so the interview that occurred in 2 sessions in 2005 was sound recorded only. He asked that the conversation be transcribed so he could clarify the wording, and he also offered to answer questions that I would jot in the margins. It was an unfamiliar format for me. Still, I instantly appreciated what an extraordinary opportunity this was to learn from and grapple with the concerns and reflections of a highly intelligent and informed artist. What I didn't know at the time is that the interview, and more specifically, Sol's written replies to my questions, would hold me in their grip for the ensuing 11 years, and that my attempts to come to terms with them would mark my own evolution as a conservator of modern and contemporary art. LeWitt was a conceptual artist, and by definition, the designation signaled that the immaterial concept of the work was tantamount to its materiality. Such a notion placed his work in a category of art whose dictates definitively shaped the approach of conservators to its care. Instead of preserving the aged original painting, we are given license by the artist's precise instructions to remake it in order to preserve the concept beyond the degradation over time of each physical iteration. Even though this directive counters conservators' time-worn charge to preserve the materials that artists employ, the undeniable precepts of conceptual artists definitely release us from those traditional constraints, boundaries that we would respect in treating, for example, a sculpture by Picasso or Barnett Newman. In truth, as my practice has evolved over the years, I have begun to see those traditional precepts concerning the primacy of the original physical object falter and even dissolve for non-conceptual material-based artists as well. Given this trend, I find myself grappling with the core relationship between immateriality and materiality in the work of artists, not just conceptual artists, and accordingly with the nature of a conservator's engagement in the preservation of both. That transition in my thinking is what I would like to explore with you this evening. My focus will be on the work of modern and contemporary artists who are often, but not always, using the industrial means of our time that were not readily available in past eras and therefore remain untested. As such, these artists can be distant from the making of the materials they employ compared to their predecessors who benefited from a traditional guild system wherein artists were apprentices for decades to master artists, or the expertise of professional colormen. My comments will not apply to the work of artists like Filippino Lippi, Johannes Vermeer, or even Mark Rothko, whose manual virtuosity continued to overwhelm our senses by the sheer rigor of its physical prowess. When I stand in front of the art of such artists, I do not think of it as exemplary of non-conceptual Italian Renaissance, Dutch, or American abstract painting. Rather, I experience it as the expression of gifted artists manipulating material for a specific visual effect. Although distinctly different from contemporary art in all the ways that we can identify, it is still a highly personal engagement that eschews broad historical classification in favor of an insistent interplay of idea and realization. That same engagement holds true for the art of our time. In response to a question about the aging of his art, LeWitt wrote, quote, "When they cleaned the Sistine ceiling, they found the colors were rich and clean, not the brown varnish we've seen before. The work should look the same as the time it was made. The artist is not responsible for the falsification of time," end of quote. I was stunned by LeWitt's phrasing that deliberately separated the painstaking artist's investment from the falsification brought about by time. Although I understood his concern over the potential distortion of aged material, I never thought of it as a falsification as such, and I was not immediately ready to convert to his thinking. After all, I had spent over 3 decades of my professional career dedicated to saving for posterity every small bit of original flanking paint, every nuance of aged media in each work of art, and every scrap of material ever touched by an artist. Conservators have traditionally preserved art, not remade it. Therefore, it was not without reservation that I tried to digest the words of this profoundly articulate and insightful conceptual artist who chose to speak to a conservator, of all people, in the waning years of his life. Thoughts about our cultural acceptance of unpainted Greek sculptures that were once colored came to mind. I wondered how Praxiteles might have responded in an interview to a question concerning the current appearance of his surviving marble work or its Roman copies. Pliny tells us, when asked to name which of his sculptures he valued most highly, Praxiteles responded, quote, "Those to which Nicias, a famous Greek painter, has put his hand," end of quote. Today, Praxiteles' art does not look the same as the time it was made, to use LeWitt's words. Clearly, the Greek artist's preference for color has been lost to time, and we have culturally accepted that falsification. Of course, coming to terms with time is a driving force of art conservation. Conservators customarily make decisions regarding the effect of time on the physicality of a work of art we're restoring or a substance we're using in a treatment. It is easy to categorize Sol's remark as that of an acknowledged conceptual artist and confidently repaint or remake his work because he himself explained that his, quote, "ideas about art are not much involved with material as an agent for making an art idea or an artwork," end quote. Rather, they value a distinction between concept and perceptual manifestation. But what about artists who are not categorized as conceptual artists and are notoriously invested in the material aspects of their work, but who to an increasing degree share in LeWitt's attitude? I'm thinking of the American artist Richard Serra. I have never met nor interviewed Richard Serra, but I was struck by his responses in an interview published in the Art newspaper in 2013. Apparently, a drawing owned by him and included in an exhibition of his art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York was abraded, and Serra reworked it. He regarded the intervention as a conservation treatment, and when asked by a concerned museum professional if the work should be double dated, that is, an institutional notation of an original date of the making and the date of the reworking by the artist, separated by a slash, he said no, quote, "because the concept has not been reworked," end quote. He explained, "Let me put it this way. Usually, if a work is destroyed or damaged and there is a possibility of recovering it, then if it can be saved, I try to save it. I think it is my responsibility to make sure the work exists in the way I want it to exist." End of quote. In this published statement, we hear the same thoughts expressed by LeWitt regarding accountability and authority, except this time they are from an artist celebrated for his investment in materiality. Yet, he claims the responsibility to preserve the work as he wants it to be seen, and he insists upon the primacy of the date of the concept. Sarah took the same uncompromised position with regard to the double dating of Prop on the left of the screen, a 1968 work owned by the Whitney Museum that he partially remade for an exhibition at MoMA, New York, several years ago. At the time, as a conservator, I vehemently objected to the absence of a double date given the artist's later intervention. Maybe double dating seems logical to conservators because we prize the sanctity of the original fabric of the work of art and want to distinguish it from subsequent interventions. However, given the priority of the artistic investment at the moment of conception for both an avowed conceptual artist, LeWitt, and a blatantly non-conceptual artist, Sarah, I now find the proposition of double dating more complex and nuanced. It seems fiercely dependent upon the nature of the artist's reentry. Is there a conundrum at work here with regard to an artist's innate relationship to the work and its preservation that may fundamentally impact conservators' treatment decisions and actions in addition to our official notations? With that question in mind, I recall two conversations I had with Cy Twombly in the late 1990s. Standing together in front of his opus, Say Goodbye, Catullus, to the Shores of Asia Minor, 1994, Cy asked me what could be done to mitigate a distinct difference in ground color between two sections of the large painting. Oh, I guess it's not working. Oh, is it working over there? Oh, yeah. Thanks, Yve-Alain. It's right here. It's a three-part painting. One part's there, second, and then the third's off there. The ground is the layer the artist traditionally puts on the canvas before applying the paint. And he wanted to know what could be done about it. I asked how it occurred, and he explained that he had created the painting in spurts over 2 decades. He rolled out just enough of the prepared linen that he intended to use during one painting campaign, and he kept the rest unfurled on its proprietary wooden dowel. During a hiatus of several years, the unrolled fabric aged differently from the exposed and painted canvas, so he ended up with the same ground material differing in color. This difference in aging is a phenomenon familiar to conservators, but an unexpected development for Twombly. When I explained there was nothing I could do to correct the difference, he let it go. But I was struck by how engaged he still was with a painting that he had begun over 20 years earlier. On another occasion, while discussing one of his Lexington paintings, untitled 1959, he regretted a linear score in the paint that resulted from the folding of the canvas during a shipment from the US to Italy in the late 1950s. Upon its arrival in Europe, his wife applied white paint to the fold line, but Cy was never satisfied with the result, despite our subsequent attempts to improve it at the Menil collection. Once, during a walk through the Twombly Gallery, he nonchalantly confided to me that he intended to add, when he had a chance, more elements to the painting in order to visually break up the linear distraction. He died before that opportunity arose. Yet the assumption that he still had the authority to do that, even though he no longer owned the painting, both impressed and plagued me as a museum professional. There existed Despite the passage of time, an insistent commitment and responsibility to the work that Twombly felt entitled him to re-enter it. This insistent engagement is not a new phenomenon born of the late 20th century. To cite just one example, it is known that Pierre Bonnard was notorious for asking friends to distract guards while he retouched a painting on exhibition, or visiting collectors with a small paint box in his pocket. In these instances, the visible changes did not affect the conceptual construct, yet the artist still harbored an obligation akin to Serra's to get it the way he wanted it, despite the inconvenience of ownership by a museum or private collector. I began to see that an artist rarely, if ever, relinquishes the intellectual ownership of her work. Recently, Michael Heiser's actual-size Munich Rotary was installed at the Whitney Museum for the first time since its acquisition in 1996. The art consists of 6 projectors created specifically for the work in 1970, 6 stands, and 6 glass slides of the film-positive images. He made the images with a handheld camera while standing in a physical depression that he created in the alpine gravel of Munich, Germany. Each glass slide is a composite of film fragments cut and assembled by the artist. Although shown 3 times before its iteration at the Whitney, Heiser was never satisfied with the previous installations. I use the word iteration because Michael, in concert with us, remade the slides from digitized images of the original analog film and then tailored their dimension to fit the museum's exhibition space. Despite these modifications to the slides, he insisted that the projectors not be changed in any way except for minor updates to meet current industrial codes. It never occurred to Heiser that the institution might not condone his intervention. To his mind, the aged original images no longer conveyed the intentional contrast between the sharp punctuation of the gravel and a subtle confluence of the edge of the depression with the horizon. He had to get it the way he wanted it to exist. Formerly dissatisfied, Heiser now authorized this iteration as the official version. As conservators, we struggled with the nature of our multi-year intervention in this case, recognizing that we had co-finished the work with the artist. Heiser wanted to see the work realized as he had conceived it before he died. He felt he owned it, and in truth, he did own the immateriality of it. However, the Whitney owned the material manifestation. The carefully reworked result was true in the artist's estimation, but how would one describe the conservator's engagement? In response, I am reminded of an interview I conducted under the auspices of the Artist Documentation Program with Richard Tuttle in 2006. Having worked with several conservators over the years, the artist respected our profession and in the course of our conversation conveyed an impressive grasp of our abiding principles. During a break in the filming, Richard dismissively predicted, with regard to the aging of his art, that over time it would all have to be remade. I swiftly responded in jest, "Oh, then I'll be out of a job," to which he replied in characteristic seriousness, "No, you'll be making it." At the time, I laughed, but since then, I have increasingly seen his prediction come to pass. While suited to Richard's work, this course of action naturally does not apply to all art, but it is not restricted to his production either. Whether in the guise of making exhibition copies, replacing damaged or inherently fragile parts, or upgrading technology, replication has joined conservators' repertoire of treatment alternatives. That doesn't mean that it never existed before as an option, but the prevalent authority and frequency with which it has entered our conservation studios begs for characterization within our professional modus operandi. To start, how would we distinguish a replica from a mere duplication? The artist Robert Smithson made a clear distinction with regard to one of his works entitled Mirror and Crushed Shells, Sanibel Island. In a letter dated July 9, 1969, Robert Smithson wrote the following to Andy Warhol. Dear Andy, this is to certify that the mirror with crushed shells, Sanibel Island, is an original work of art. It consists of 3 mirrors, which may be restored if broken, and 1 burlap bag of crushed shells collected by the artist at Sanibel Island, April 1969. If any shells are ever lost, the owner has the right to restore the work by collecting more shells from Sanibel Island, northern part of the island, see map of the site, which is part of the work. The 3 mirrors are held in place in a corner by the pressure of the shells only, see photo. The work is owned by Andy Warhol and cannot be duplicated. Signed, Robert Smithson. For many years, in citing this example, I've been intrigued by the demarcation that Smithson made between replacing all the parts of the work and duplicating it. In the current context of museum practice, I see a different irony. Smithson categorically rejected the making of duplicates in his work, yet museums worldwide have installed exhibition copies of Smithson's art, of his rocks, for example, rather than assume the cost of packing and shipping heavy boulders across oceans. There is rarely an indication that the exhibited material is not original, since it seems the concept overrides the initial materiality in certain museum applications. Still, exhibition copies are duplicates that are destroyed after use or otherwise isolated, and artists are protected by copyright laws on both sides of the Atlantic from any sort of proliferation or deviation unauthorized by the artist or her representatives. As such, a replication, in an institutional sense anyway, is an intensely researched, vetted, and approved reiteration, for it is often the artist and conservator, among other museum professionals, who inform that process. Years ago, an exhibition of early work by Ed Kienholz was installed at the Menil Collection. Among the prominent works on display was a pair of related sculptures entitled John Doe, 1959, and Jane Doe, 1960. John Doe represented the archetypal man, American man, equipped with wheels that assured his mobility, a symbolic cross in his empty heart, and a portable male part that could be taken out of the drawer and used as the spirit moved him. Jane Doe, on the other hand, embodied the demure young woman who was stationary, wore a white bridal gown, and hid beneath her dress 3 drawers containing elements associated with the 3 stages of womanhood: virginity, childbearing, and old age. When John Doe entered the Menil Collection, the portable male part, made of cheap industrial rubber, had completely disintegrated into powder, and Kienholz remade the part from a new rubber mask reminiscent of the original one he had purchased in Los Angeles decades before. Months later, when Jane Doe arrived as a loan for the exhibition, the curator was stunned by the tawdry aged appearance of her wedding gown. Unlike the inviolate whiteness of the original, the fabric was now irreparably stained by the owner's assortment of pet birds. Unfortunately, the artist had died, but his widow and the curator, who was a close confidant of Kienholz's, Walter Hopps, authorized the making of another dress because the irreparable aged condition of the original destroyed the artist's conceptual framework. Were I to cast this example in LeWitt's terms, I would avow that the immateriality of the work was falsified by the damaged materiality. So I made another dress and basically affected Tuttle's prediction. I should add here, throughout this conference, after I gave my talk, I kept hearing people say, well, would you make the dress or not? Over and over again. In other words, I was a co-producer of Ed Keenoltz's work. This term is not to suggest that the conservator is co-equal with the artist, but a collaborator in some degree. More and more, I am hearing conservators and institutions muse that we, supposed preservers of the past, are becoming co-producers alongside emerging and sometimes canonical artists. Along with the exhibition staff, we help the artists figure out how something should be made, or we research thoroughly how something could be perfectly replicated. Then we do it. But aren't we conservators dedicated to the preservation of the original materialization of a work of art and not the making of it? Has something changed with regard to our professional manner of working? It seems with old master art anyway, conservators are perfectly comfortable in preserving what we determine to be the inevitable appearance of age. For instance, we respect the craquelure in Rembrandt's paintings and the distressed wood in Donatello's Magdalena. We preserve these aged surfaces and even venerate them because they reassuringly embrace the passage of time, and the effect is beautiful. Still, however cogent that assessment may seem, and I'm a proponent, it's a bold judgment. The treatment is based on a professional assumption of how an aged work of art should look, and that premise may, in fact, not reflect the artist's initial artistic investment. Yet, conservators often pride themselves on getting into the artist's skin in order to identify aberrant interventions and thereby restore the work to its original state, allowing, of course, for some degree of aging that we have determined is unavoidable and therefore acceptable. This is commendable work, and we do it because at heart, especially in a museum context, conservators are keepers of history. However, in truth, we do not restore works of art to an original state, despite conservators' contentions and nomenclature. We may remove past restorations and other human interferences, but we don't end up with a work in its first youth. Rather, it is a naturally aged state of the work of art, not as it appeared when the artist put down her brush or chisel or final screen and assigned a signature. We can't really bring a Palaiuolo or Da Vinci painting back to what we assume was its primary appearance, and therefore we temper what has survived in order to come in as close as we can to the original expression. Garnering whatever information we can glean from the artist or historical chronicles of practice, we utilize our professional intuition, expertise, and skill to restore the work in the artist's stead. As such, are we not, in essence, co-producers? Even though the nature of our engagement may differ in degree, the overriding directive of working closely with a living artist or deceased artist's legacy to simulate what was originally achieved remains eerily similar. What you're looking at here is a Palaiuolo painting that has been stripped of all restoration at the top, and then the bottom is the restored work. There was not a change in coloration so much, it's just a question of the slides. I actually took this slide last weekend at Yale. It was nice to see the painting again. I certainly recall the controversy that was caused by the stripping of all paint that was not original from Trecento and Quattrocento paintings in the Jarvis collection at the Yale Art Gallery. Following the orders of the curator, the conservator left us with fragments of former artworks that were subsequently reconstructed by talented conservators elsewhere. We saw paintings transition from original remnants to fully restored works, and that informed transition, or to a degree, co-production, rings true to what is occurring today in my mind. Another complication for conservators, embedded in the diverse categories of contemporary art, is the thorny question of precisely what is the original to be restored. A case in point, representative of a growing class of objects, is a work by the artist Josh Klein entitled Cost of Living, Aleda. It's on view in the galleries, actually. Acquired by the Whitney 2 years ago, it is a non-traditional portrait of Aleda, a housekeeper in a New York hotel whose humanity has been reduced to the impersonal fragmentation of her body parts that are barely distinguishable from the tools she uses for her work. The socio-political overtones are strong. The sculptural assemblage consists of a commercially made janitor's cart equipped with LED lights that bears sculptural forms that were 3D printed in plaster and ink. A code, or programming language, dictated how the computerized machine tools should make the forms in order to accomplish its task. Acknowledging that the code for the 3D printing of parts held detailed information beyond the current capability of 3D printers, the artist advised that we ultimately discard after use the current physical manifestations of the prints. That is, the brushes, sponges, bottle, Aleda's head, hand, and foot, and reprint them at a later date when the capability of the printers evolved to match the detailed sophistication of the code. When pressed, Klein was vague as to the value of the current printed parts, the hands and the head, for example. Should we keep them for the record or not? He wasn't exactly sure when they should be reprinted, nor what to do about old file formats of data as the software changes over time. However, even though the code was the sustainable component of the work and the prints were not, Klein was adamant that the objects were his art and that he is a sculptor. But if the physical reality of the work of art continues to change intentionally over time, then what is the date of the work? Maybe it is the date of conception and not that of the recurrent materializations after all. And to take that notion further, what are we as conservators charged to conserve? The Articles of Association for the International Institute of Conservation confirm that conservation's founding fathers focused their attention in the 1950s on materiality, but kept an impressive open mind with regard to interpretation. Although they stipulated that, quote, conservation means any action taken to determine the nature or properties of materials used in any kinds of cultural holdings or in their housing, handling, or treatment, they went on to authorize any action necessary to further the understanding and controlling of the causes of deterioration of historic and artistic works. Since the causes of deterioration can be broadly interpreted within our current scenario, I began to reconsider the working assumptions of conservators. Do we presume that there is a totemic state of an aged work of art? I've often heard myself naively propose that the end game with regard to aging is the moment that the work of art enters a museum's collection. Is that one of our assumptions, or are conservators participants in an exchange with multiple conditions that arise over time? As conservators, we seem to be customarily attuned to the original concept in the moment of realization. Even though we admit that physical states are always changing, we routinely accept the charge to try with increasingly sophisticated means to mollify those transitions. It gets particularly complicated if we try to stop aging by turning the clock back to, say, Praxiteles' colored sculptures, because art, and art appreciation to a degree, is a flow of cultural creativity. It's ongoing, and conservators are stewards of this process that is alive and changing. Recognizing the duality of art as both form and expression, Richard Tuttle clarified that even though art is invisible, it is indelibly linked to the visible. He noted that conservation is about the visible side of the link, but not only about the visible. For this reason, he concluded, quote, "My generation's kind of art has been hard on conservation because it pushes conservation on that one side where art becomes visible," end of quote. Traditionally, conservators have assumed decisive authority over the physical state of the visible by determining the feasibility of treatment options. Naturally, informed art professionals and the marketplace have exerted particular influences, but ultimately conservators have been the notoriously reluctant but decidedly determinate players. Even though routinely artists' opinions have been sought, the decision-making has resided within the intellectual domain of the institution. Interestingly, just as conservators are becoming more comfortable with realizing the artist's vision through co-production, the artists are assuming more authority over the aging state of their material expression and are increasingly seeking conservators' talent. 8 years ago, the Whitney Museum sensed what was developing with regard to authority and tried to come to terms with the incrementally changing cultural terrain by forming a replication committee. The purpose of the committee was to debate and decide upon the appropriateness, for lack of a better word, of each request for partial or full replication. The committee consists of stakeholders equally representing departments that range from curatorial and conservation to registration, collection documentation, archives, and legal counsel. At stake is authority over the state of the materiality of the work of art. We have worked closely with artists whose work was under discussion, and their sense of the immaterial has guided our interpretations. It has ended up being a balancing act between the artist's authority and the institution's role as a keeper of history. We had intended over time that we would arrive at consistent decisions pertaining to kindred cases and thereby set precedents upon which policies could develop. To the contrary, as the diversity and breadth of the caseload has expanded, we are increasingly confronted by independent decisions that reflect and ultimately connote evolving paradigms. So, where do conservators stand in this shifting cultural landscape? Perhaps our traditional devotion to preserving the aged appearance or initial iteration of a work of art at all costs, when it can reasonably be remade, needlessly falsifies the artist's artistic investment. Since we are charged with the preservation of not only the physical, but also the inseparable conceptual aspect of art, I wonder if indeed we are the arbiters of ethics in this scenario. Undeniably, we are the professionals in the art trenches who are actually doing the work and not writing or speaking about it particularly. We might be caught in a contemporary fluctuation of values and approaches, but we have a sustainable tradition to draw upon. Throughout the ages, there have been multiples, replicas, and certainly fabrications by hands other than the artist, such as sculptural editions. Some have survived, and some have come down to us in the form of acceptable, albeit falsified, that is, not true to the artist's original artistic investment, copies. In defining a way forward, we as a profession have rigorously taken into account the historical legacy or the active voice of the artist. Moreover, our time-worn methodologies have relentlessly tried to recognize and respect the authority of the artist's voice. By studying related works or researching contemporary texts for technical clues, we partner with the artist's awareness before embarking on a treatment. We are continuing to do that in the contemporary scene by co-producing, emulating, and rigorously documenting actions in order to confront potential falsifications of time. As highly trained and informed contributors to an ongoing professional dialogue foreseen by our forebears, conservators exercise a privilege that is not only ambitious, but exhilarating. Addressing what would become the preferred format of his posthumous catalogue raisonné, Sol LeWitt shared the following thought with me after our last session. I hope you're going to write this up. It would be really, really very important to the book because it'll bring everything together, materially and ideologically. You take not only the material problems, technical problems, but also problems of thinking about how the work is made. So that's the whole thing in some measure. I'm glad you're doing it. End of quote. Initially challenged by Sol's remark, in the end, I decided that he got it right. Time can falsify the initial sensation of the work of art that may not come down through the ages as intended, and the responsibility does not rest with the artist. Rather, it is the shifting influence of time that reinterprets the appearance of the work of art and may even remake it to a degree. It is a fluid process. So while the artist responsibly insists that the work exists the way she wants it, in reality, that edict prevails primarily in her generation, it seems. Thereafter, the work belongs to another time and rests in the hands of those responsible for its care, conservators among others. LeWitt recognized this inevitability and intentionally prevented that falsification by authorizing with precise instructions his work to be remade into the future. Yet, like Tuttle, he also intuited that the preservation and now replication would reside in the conservator's domain, given our professional propensity to look at art both materially and ideologically. So it seems fitting to end these thoughts tonight by acknowledging with fervor the evolving complexity these days of a conservator's professional pursuit, while also taking note of the ambitious and often ill-defined endeavor, in LeWitt's terms, of doing it, because after all, quote, that's the whole thing in some measure. Thank you.
Well, we have long collaborated for a long time, and we taught Harvard together, and we even participated in lectures like that. And I think the last time we had both our little loop, and we looked like Martians exploring. Your talk is so rich that I don't quite know how to start, but I would say something, which is that you have done a lot. I don't know if you have done the most of conservators, but certainly you have been on the top of the line to consider the issue of conservation as something which is part of history of art. Or let's say you have always considered that what you have to do as a conservator necessitated from you knowledge of the history of art, and which you did by studying literature, but also in your case speaking with artists directly. Now, this notion that conservation is something that is linked to the historical knowledge is something that is actually rather new. I remember, and in fact, many disasters in conservation, which we saw from close. Angelica Rinshine and I organized the show of Mondrian, had to do with the fact that those conservators who did this damage to the painting were doing it in absolute good faith because they didn't know historically what was involved, and they had a wrong interpretation of Mondrian, which was that of design. When you scratch your porch, then you repaint it. Well, in fact is that Mondrian's brushwork were very important, especially in the white parts, because you would have different directions to make sure that the the light would strike those white rectangles differently, and so it would not be a neutral white all over the painting. So that's a technical historical knowledge that they didn't have, so they took wrong decisions, which is exactly what your work prevents. And I would just underline the fact that you gradually became more and more interested in historical, production of the work, and the role it has, the knowledge of that has to do with the comprehension of the work through your work on contemporary art. And it is why you are a good historian. That is, it's a work of the present that led you to understand the whole thing of conservation as something historical, which means as something that involves knowledge but also choice. Because there was always this issue of choice in conservation. Simply people didn't realize that there was choice. They thought that they were just restoring to the original, but they didn't realize that they were actually making decisions when doing that. Well, I think that because you work with contemporary artists, and because of these new challenges that you analyze so well about the new techniques and all it involves, and this notion of being replication from as exemplified by LeWitt. Because of that, it led you to become an historian despite yourself in a way. And so there's one question to start that I would like to ask. You very aptly, I think, showed the link between the conceptual and the visual, or let's say the way in which they are what you call the invisible and the visible, what Turtle call it. But I mean, the way they are totally intertwined. Is there, because I think I've always been interested in that issue, is there for you some kind of threshold, let's say, where you feel that the work has lost its visual and thus conceptual integrity? I think that it's clear when your hesitation and thought about the keynote's address is typical of that. But is there, in your experience, is there a moment where you feel like this really can't go anymore? I mean, a few, dog poop, whatever, a few things. But is there a moment where suddenly you're struck that something has to be made?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question.
Well,
yeah,
I don't know, but
sure
it's the starting one.
Yeah. What immediately comes to mind is my work on the Rothko Chapel, which went over maybe 15 years. The Rothko Chapel is in Houston, and it's 14 monochromatic paintings, large mural-sized paintings, and 6 of them are large black rectangles with plum borders around them. When I moved to Houston, Dominique Dumenil, who had commissioned the chapel from Mark Rothko, said there was a serious condition problem there, and could I take a look? And when I went, what I saw was a white film had begun to appear. There was white, what appeared as white intervention on these black paintings. And then I didn't know anything about Mark Rothko, and not enough to even think about this, and I tried to find someone who could help do this for her. So she sent me to New York, and I decided to try to find this assistant of Mark Rothko's, whose name was Ray Kelly. So I went, we had phone books back in those days, and I went down the phone book and called every R. Kelly in New York, and started by saying, "Did you know Mark Rothko?" And they go, "What? Who?" That went on for a while. And finally somebody said, "No one has asked me that for years." And it was Ray Kelly. And so he came down to Houston, and he painted out simulations of the Rothko chapel. He painted paintings with me, just as he had done with Mark Rothko, so I could see what the materials were. And he showed the materials anyway. So I began to get a sense of what the materials were, but that still didn't explain what was causing the whiting on the chapel paintings. It took years to figure it out. The chemists, it was a downturn in the oil business, so there were chemists twiddling their thumbs in Houston, polymer chemists, and so they helped sort this out. And it turned out to be a change in the media from the high humidity in the building. But the question is, okay, what are we going to do about it? And the condition to me was so against what Rothko had intended with these paintings. I mean, it became a design on them. And then there were crystals came out. It was just amazing that something had to be done, but it gave me confidence to do it because it was scary to treat the Rothko Chapel paintings. But because it was so bad, it gave me confidence to try. And my first attempt wasn't very good, and I know where it is, and I look at it every time I go into the chapel. But there's sometimes when the materiality has changed to so interfere with what was intended, I think the conservator, and I'd be interested to know what you think, Jack, or other conservators think, it gives us a little more urgency to do something. And not urgency in terms of speed, but courage.
But it's based on an interpretation that you have of
That's
what is
right.
the intention of the artist.
That's right.
That's even the case of when the artist is alive, because it's the interpretation maybe of the artist has, but it can change. His own interpretation of his own work can change, which is the example of Bonnard. You know, I mean, obviously, if he wants to fill with a painting that he has soul, that is signed, that is way, it means that his conception of what he intends to do is subject to change.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't believe I really thought he was going to go in the Twombly Gallery and add some more, a few more things to his painting. It was amazing to me that he just naturally thought he would do that. Yeah. So I want to turn the question around to you.
Sure.
So what about works of art that have changed dramatically over time? How has that affected art history?
Well, it's an interesting. I mean, it's actually quite fundamental for the discipline. I would say that the first real art historian was Alois Rigaud, and he's the first one to have decided. You know, when his first book on late late antiquity, he's the first one who said, "This is not decadence. It's not ugly. They just had a different idea of what to do. It's not that they failed to do the beautiful Pompeian thing. It's that they wanted to change completely. They had a completely new sense of what art and what they wanted to paint or to sculpt." And it's also in the same way that he wrote his book on Baroque, which was at that time, you know, quite considered a summit of kitsch. And he continued all his work. But his last work actually was commissioned by the emperor of Austrian Empire, and which has to do. He was asked to write a report on the issue of restoration. And at that time, there was a big scandal all over Europe about the very heavy-handed restorations by Viollet-le-Duc of Gothic monuments in France. And, you know, there were many crumbling monuments everywhere, and the cultural services of the Austrian Empire didn't want to be caught in making the same mistakes or be caught in the same kind of scandal. So they asked Rigaud, what should we do? And he wrote a fantastic book called The Modern Cult of Monuments, in which he basically explains that it's always a matter of choice. And one of the examples which I always love that he gives of Botticelli, which has been repainted, added little frou-frous in the 18th century. And he said, okay, we can take out the frou-frous of the 18th century, but we know they are the 18th century frou-frous. What's under, we don't know if it's original. Mm-hmm. So what is historic? We have to make a choice. We have to decide if we take out the late editions as something fraudulent, but do we actually know what the original was? Not really. We know what the 18th century for sure because it's there. So it's right from the start, issues of the integrity of a time and interventions played a big role in the original thinking of art history as a discipline. It played a role right from the start. Does that answer?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think recently I've been thinking about. It's not only time-based media art, actually, and maybe Josh's work fits in there too, where, yeah, it does. Like what you go in the galleries now and you see Aleda, you see three versions of Aleda. And maybe 10 years from now, you'll come to the Whitney and they'll look very different because they will have been printed with more sophisticated paraphernalia. And if we keep the date, original date, 2014, then one suggestion has been that you literally list versions as
But
they
then there
come
would be,
thereafter.
the work would become a kind of diary of the
Yes,
of the progressive sophistication of the.
yes.
Well,
In a way,
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of documenting what the centuries were doing too, changing over time, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know, I hear that well, the replication committee, by the way, I want to say a little bit about the replication committee. This all came, I saw you point, is Angelica over there somewhere? Oh, there she is. Angelica Rudenstein at the Mellon Foundation funded this very important conference that occurred at Tate on inherent vice in sculpture and works of art, and brought together people from all over the world to discuss this issue. And it was very, very important conference, which really started us all thinking about these changes in replication. And when I came back to New York, I was telling Donna about it, and Donna said, well, why don't you start a replication committee here? We have, these questions are coming up, and generally when the question for replication comes up, it goes to the curator or the director who makes the decision, but it isn't kind of vetted by all. So 8 years ago, that's how the committee started at Donna's suggestion, and it has grown to really embrace a lot of these intellectual questions that are growing.
And I would add to about the Tate, the beginning of this.
Yeah.
It started because the estate of Naum Gabo
Right.
had given to the Tate Gallery a whole bunch of his models in plexiglass, or whatever. I think it's called plexiglass already, and they were suddenly, like your keynotes,
Male part.
male
Yeah.
part. They were just like crumbling to pieces. And the very interesting thing is that from what I remember, the conservators there said that this material, which is sometimes in the 20s or 30s or 40, well, could stay stable for a very long time, and then suddenly something clicked, and then it would deteriorate quite fast. So they had still quite a few of the. They had some which had already totally disintegrated. There are some that were disintegrating and emitting a very strange smell of vinegar. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
And there is a chemical explanation, but I thought it was quite amazing that this little plexiglass thing would just suddenly decide to smell like vinegar. But then there were also that were not disintegrating yet, but would eventually be. So the question was, what do we do? Should we just have them redone before, as we still know their shape? And it was interesting discussions. I was for a redoing plus photograph of the original, and I think eventually everyone kind of agreed with that. But this was a precise historical question, and I must say when I saw the Morley large exhibition at the Guggenheim, I was struck by the fact that there were far less objects in plexiglass than the first show of Morley show at the Guggenheim in 1970, where there were much more, particularly the box pieces with the shadow and all that. And I'm sure the same happened. They have, well, I'm not sure, but I imagine that the same happened, that they have disintegrated because they were the same kind of material that Gabo was doing. So had people been already thinking of in those terms then, maybe we still have, something, some trace that would be giving some documentation of the work. And I think this process, in this particular case, the replication is, kind of, it's like a documentation. It's a sculpture is better, let's say, documented in 3D than in just a old black and white photograph.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing. Documentation has definitely moved to the top of the list of things we do, and doing it in 3D imaging as well, both in terms of knowing what it looked like and documenting what it looked like, and also in terms of installations and all that, just having a record of these things.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, shall we turn it over to them?
Sure.
Okay.
Is it on? Oh, it is on, sorry. Thank you, Carol, for your talk. One issue that I'm curious about and how often this has come up in your work with artists is the fact that materials are often from a historical moment and those materials can't be replicated, say 30 years later. So for instance, how industrial felts were made with particular materials in the 70s and they're no longer made with those materials. So how often do these issues come up in your discussions with artists, and do they usually prefer the visual over the historical materials, or what are some issues that arise?
It depends very much on the artist. It's really hard to generalize. I think the visual is really important, that it looks right, and that is part of restoration. Like we might use a modern material to recreate the look. But I'm reminded of an artist named Dario Robleto, who chooses materials for their inherent meaning. So the classic story that I tell, which is kind of old, but anyway, it was he had the Whitney purchased something as soon as I came here, and there was a butterfly or something, and it had an antenna coming out, and I said to him, he was a very young artist, or he never talked to a conservator before, so he goes, well, what do conservators do? And I said, well, for example, if this broke off and we lost it, I would find a plastic that was very similar in appearance to it and absolutely recreate it to look like what you had there. He goes, you can't do that. I go, well, I think I can. He goes, no, you can't do that. He said, that was made out of the record of James Brown's Sex Machine, and you have to use that, because that's central to the meaning of this work. And then he went on to explain that. So I don't mean that means that we ran out and got everything that he has in those works, but it is, I have continued to talk to him about that, because it really is a question. I mean, if the essence of the material is central to what he feels he's conveying, I have said to him that I continue to interview him, is that maybe restoration should be visible. I mean, if something's broken, just literally make it clear that we've stuck something back. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but it really varies depending upon what the artist's intention.
I am a preservationist in terms of buildings, and if one's looking at a 19th century brownstone, often the wooden beams have to be sistered with steel. I mean, it's a new technology available to us that allows us to preserve it, because sometimes what's keeping up a house is the two houses next to it. So when it comes to art, again, there's a physical structure like the stretchers of a canvas. When that starts to go, would you consider a new technology, Kevlar stretchers that will last forever? Or is there going to be somebody out there 200 years from now specializing in 21st century stretchers, for canvases?
Do you want me to answer that?
No, yes.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
I can.
I think, and I will defer to the conservators here and what they think, but I think if it's not visible, like if the stretcher is not part of the visible design, like stretched backwards where you actually see it, I think we take a little more license there in making things that we think are stronger and more durable. We tend to respect the original wood stretchers, although I have worked on paintings of aluminum stretchers. That was an idea at one point. They turned out to be really problematic, but it's true. What do you think, Jack, in terms of sculpture? Is that?
I think stability would have to override.
What Jack said is he was saying stability would be the prime factor that we would look for.
Well, there's also the example of, speaking of Palermo, where his stretchers actually are, because the fabric touches the stretcher, they are not lined or anything, they're just fabric pieces of cotton that he bought in a fabric market. The wood of the stretcher is damaging the color so that's important to find a way for the conservator to find a way to prevent that. You can't revert it, but you can prevent for it from happening to other pieces and all that. So that's a case where it's a bit like adding a metal beam. It's not necessarily visible. Speaking about the architecture, it's a good example because I'm not an expert at all, but as far as I know, most of Chinese architecture, which is on wood, has always been remade constantly. So an imperial city is actually has been endlessly remade for centuries. So, you know, maybe there's not a single piece of the original wood in most of the Chinese monuments. And that has not, so they were very different way of thinking about those things. But there, the conceptual and was, if you will, reigning over the visual.
Yes.
Completely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a very.
So this idea of the celebration, or the, you know, really focused totally on the existing physical, is a very Western, I think. I don't know if that's fair to say. It's not fair to say broadly, but
it's not completely true either,
yeah.
because, you know, calligraphy, for example, and the movement of the brush is very personal in Chinese culture. But on the other hand, you know, they have a different mode of respect, let's say, because a collector can add his stamp and can even add calligraphy in the middle of the painting. I mean, it's a very different culture for all those things. But
it's interesting to think about, though, in terms of what we're facing today with contemporary art and additions and changes, iterations. Yes.
How often does the replication committee meet? Like,
Oh, that's a good
how
question.
central is it to the conservation department at the Whitney at large?
We thought, originally, we thought it would meet twice a year, maybe, you know. We meet about every month, every other month. Sometimes
because of urgent issues?
Because of things that come up, all kinds of things that come up. And yes, we do. And sometimes we have to do an email because something's urgent, a decision has to be made, but we do.
It's fascinating, those things that have emerged in the last 20 years. I mean, when I said that, you know, remember when we started the work, going to look at the works of Barnett Newman all over the planet, and many of them in museum conservation department, often the curators didn't even know what the conservation department was.
Yeah.
It has completely changed now. It's not possible. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Bill Rubin at MoMA had no idea what the conservation department was doing. In fact, they did a couple of things which were very bad, and he didn't even know, and some he knew, like throwing away all the frames of Mondrian, for example, or, you know, or varnishing a Braque. But you know, the culture has really changed, and I think you played a major role in that. I played a tiny role.
That's just because I'm the oldest one around. No,
it's true.
It has.
Now art historians are interested in what conservators have to say. They were not when I started art history. You know, there was like a different world. And conservators, thanks to you in great part, are basically, you know, say we should know historically what something means. It's not only necessarily the intention of the artist, because sometimes you can't reconstruct that, but it's all the historical context and what it meant to do that at this time and all that. And that's a new phenomenon. That's a new engagement with this material, which I think is fantastic.
I think that's fair to say, Donna. We spend a lot of time dealing with issues from our different perspectives, which is also very interesting because we look at it so differently. Even Yve-Alain and I had knockdown dragouts over Barnett Newman because we would just look at it so very differently, and decided to continue to argue until we agreed. It took about an hour and a half in front of every painting, but we managed to get there. Yeah.
For the great horror of the collectors.
I know, get these people out of here.
Carol, you referred to this a little bit in your discussion of sort of the aging of Rembrandt or the loss of color in Greek sculpture, but I'm curious about the sort of splitting of the life of the work and its original idea and original material, the way that the idea takes its material form, and then the influence of the work in its aged state. So as an example, like if Eva Hesse was still alive and we could talk to her and she said, this is not how my work is supposed to look, can you please remake it in more stable plastics? But in the intervening years, the aged effect of her work has been so influential on generations of artists since. And so it feels like the work kind of splits into two lives, how the artist intended it and the life it has subsequently. And so therefore, which are you more beholden to?
I think that's why I was using the word fluid. I felt It's interesting that you brought up that example, Elizabeth, because Elizabeth Sussman still here? No. When Elizabeth was doing her Eva Hesse show, she brought some people together just to talk about this exact issue. And one of them was Sol LeWitt,
Right, yeah.
because he had worked with Eva Hesse. And he was just horrified that conservators were talking about trying to restore or preserve or keep as best we could this stuff that had just changed. He said, absolutely not, just remake it. This is just wrong. You can't do it. It was really a very lively argument that went on. And Sol he did not change he was adamant about it. But I think what you're bringing up is that a history can be written looking at two very different appearances of a work of art. And that's true. And that needs to be acknowledged. But at least we're aware of it. My first question to Yve-Alain was, what about things that art historians are not necessarily aware of, and then how do we write about that? Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, in the Guggenheim,
Well, there's no
answer.
the thing that both what your work and your talk and even when I mentioned this book by Rigaud, the idea that there is no set answer. It's always a decision. It always has to do with the conditions and with a specific case. It's totally casuistic. You can never have a definite rule. That's what what you said about your conservation group. Meetings, you realize you couldn't have a definite set of principles that you could apply all of them, because everything, because it's a decision of what's more important. Each time it's different. So.
It is. How are we doing? Okay. Yeah.
Done.
I just wondered if you. I just wondered if you could say a little bit, Carol, about some of the new media stuff you've been engaging with, and in particular, the whole concept of link rot, which was a completely new term to me, but just a little bit maybe more about some of those digital things that I know you're thinking about, and a whole new realm of things that really feel immaterial to us and live on a very, very conceptual plane. But I know you've been very, very concerned about and working with Christian Paul, adjunct curator for new media. I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that.
I mean, there are people in this audience who are far more informed on this topic than I am, but what I will just say is that, yes, Donna's referring to our Douglas Davis piece, which was a very, very early piece. It was like considered the first blog. And it just got to a point where it was no longer accessible. And so we had to make a switch. And what do we do? And this is, emulate. We had to change. But what I'm seeing now is it's just going so far and so fast and so changing that that's just accepted now. It's just part of the way you do things. And like when we were recently an artist of a born digital work of art came to the replication committee to defend that something he wanted to change. The work was only 3 years old, but he was already changing it, and he wanted to preserve it and yet change it, and we could do both. That's the thing. You can still have it in its first form in some iteration on the web and then still do something else. So we talked about GitHub and all this other thing of how we would restore and keep this work. So I don't feel comfortable saying more than just to say it's really, really quickly changing. A lot of it was in the Congress in Los Angeles, a lot of people dealing with those issues.
I just want to add a few words to this incredibly interesting and important dialogue between Carol's lecture, which I think was groundbreaking, and Yve-Alain's interrogation of it. The original Tate event, which Carol referred to, was conceived by the Tate as an effort to deal with that one Garbo issue. What we came to decide was that you can't just look at that one case. You have to think about the whole future from a point of view of art history, conservation, legal issues, ethical issues, an entire spectrum of thoughts about the deterioration of works of art. And they put together a group of people I think there were about 30 of us, who studied those issues, thought about them, and met for 2 or 3 days, exploring all these various approaches to the deterioration of works of art and what can one or should one do about it. And I think what's emerged, as Yve-Alain said, there's a whole new approach now to the field of conservation and the relationship between art historians and conservators. And Carol's lecture demonstrates that at the highest possible level. I think everybody in this room has been incredibly privileged to hear this, and I can't tell you how impressed I am. It's just a fantastic evolution of these ideas. And I agree with Yve-Alain, it's changed the way art historians think.
Yep.
So
It's a good note to end, I think.
I think we're out of time, so thank you all very much.